This is the final presentation of the day. We have saved a very good one for the last one, coming all the way from Austin in Texas. We have an engineering manager directly from Adobe who's going to teach us about how to keep core secure. Delighted to introduce Nathan Smith.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Smith. I am the engineering manager over Adobe Commerce Application Security. It's basically anything security related comes across my desk at some point. This is a interesting presentation that I'm able to give in the first place, given the sensitive nature of the topic. But after several rounds of review, you get to see what's left of what I had to take out. So, having said that, I was a...
Show us what you took out.
Okay, well, actually, I have a secret slide after... No, don't tell anyone. That's right, yeah, no pictures, please. Yes, I as a result, we'll see how the timing of this goes. This is a very last-minute talk, and very last-minute reviews. I only submitted this last night. I'll start off with a scary statistic. 80% of all hacked stores are because of either not being upgraded or compromised admin credentials. So think about that as we talk about the rest of this. This is what's left of my agenda. We're going to talk about who's involved in core security and what core is. We'll talk about how we handle vulnerabilities, as well as how our current release strategy incorporates security and what we're doing for making it easier to upgrade and therefore easier to stay secure. And then I'll give a very, very, very high-level overview of where we're aiming for the next release strategy that's upcoming. It may not, and one note too is Telesh gave a great talk earlier about how core is no longer the concern with security and now that's everything else. So hopefully this will illustrate why that is the case. It may not surprise you to know there's a lot of people involved in security at Adobe. They are very security-minded. A little bit about me. I've been with Adobe for almost 5 years now and working with Magento for over 7, so I've been through a lot of the pains of upgrading and things, so I feel the complaints when they come in. I started learning programming 18 years ago. I actually started with electronics and as a young teenager and found out that's expensive with no money and worked my way into programming microchips from there and turned out that's actually free to do that. So that's how I got into programming and went into web development from there. I'm very active in the community Slack. In fact, I've talked with many of you there and in person, so you can find me over there. And like I said, anything application security and really beyond related to Magento. I am over 14 people across 2 teams that is directly responsible for this, although as we'll see, there's a lot more people involved. As for me personally, I've been married over 11 years. I've got 5 kids. I live outside Austin with a whole bunch of animals. We just brought our 10th horse home just before I came out here. 10th horse, yes, and we have donkeys and all the other things listed here too. When I'm not dealing with all of that, and yes, that's a horse in my dining room. I enjoy VR and cooking, movies, hiking, and all that other stuff, long walks on the beach, you know, all that jazz. Scope of my team. So it's a little bit tricky. So while this is about keeping core secure, core relates to everything. So every single thing we talk about here, all the integrations and PWA and all that stuff is affected by core and can be, they relate directly to each other. So even if it's not core related, there's a good chance that we're involved. And we're going to talk about some of these things up here now, but that's like kind of the full scope of all the things that we deal with. Specifically, I'll call out that we're also doing security reviews for other parts of the product, including the various SaaS services that are coming out, like live search and product recommendations and things like that. So our scope is ever growing. There's a lot of other people involved in security, though. We work with a lot of stakeholders throughout the company, and we indirectly report to them as well. And that is a real hacker, by the way. I got his permission to post that here. But we have a lot of people that take a look at various things, from code to customer escalations to it's all over the place. And as a result, there's a lot of eyes on different security problems, and that makes for a stronger and hardened product. So when we talk about core, we're really talking about kind of anything in the default meta package. So that includes the core pieces like CE, EE, and B2B, but also any of the core bundled extensions, and then whatever remaining vendor bundled extensions that we put in. And while it technically doesn't cover things like the SaaS integrations, PWA Studio, or the other thing, and certainly things not like merchant customizations, those can be affected by our team's purview as well, because they're all connected. So what is security anyway? Well, it's a loaded term. It's adversarial response, compliance, and privacy. It's usually what we mean when we talk about security. We like to focus on the vulnerabilities and the scary things we see in the news, but really those other two are built around security in the first place. You can't have privacy or compliance without security. And ultimately, security is risk management, and risk management involves risk thresholds, and everybody has a different threshold. For example, I'd never do what this guy's doing right now. He has a different risk threshold than me. And depending on what size merchant you are and what stage you are in your life cycle, you're going to have a very different threshold as well, and you're going to make different decisions based on that. We don't have that luxury. We have to make decisions that are the best for everyone, so we have to get rid of basically all risks. And on that note, let's talk about how we handle vulnerabilities when they come in. So generally when we talk about vulnerabilities, it's broken down into one of two paths. So broad path kind of affect everybody, and we'll get into both of these in more detail in a second. This is kind of the general workflow that we follow for handling these. It's not unlike handling vulnerability, just regular bugs really. But obviously there's different things to consider when you're talking about sensitive things. So the broad vulnerabilities are things that affect everyone, things like Log4j. Sorry if I sent shivers down your spine by saying that. And more recently, things like Dirty Pipe. Our goal is to get the tickets created and distribute those to all the affected teams to mitigate and discover where we're exposed to these vulnerabilities as fast as possible, so we can get them under control and move on. And then we also look at what other layers of security we can add on top of that to have maybe prevented us from being exposed to that in the first place. Deep vulnerabilities are a little bit more specific. So these generally target a specific product or service, and the extent to how we deal with those sort of depends on what scope it is affected by. This is a very blurry overview of our flowchart of all the different ways that we can potentially handle those. I'm not going over this, but just to show there's a lot of things that it can cover. And it covers everything from ethical hackers reporting vulnerabilities all the way up to the very rare case that we have an actively exploited in the wild 0-day vulnerability where there are extremely tight timelines, very rapid communications, and things like that. And everything, false alarms, people just having unpatched releases, basically everything in between. So there's so many different use cases, even just as simple as a customer that ran a scan and they say, hey, we have something that's concerning. Are we vulnerable to something? And I'm not going to go through this, but this is the general process for the high-level phases that we take to solve these kinds of issues. And it's not unlike, a typical bug workflow that you would solve with any type of bug. But depending on what it is, you might have more timelines, more sensitivity. You may be racing against a hacker, against the clock. When we are patching vulnerabilities at our discretion, we can also issue hotfixes. This is generally only for ultra-critical things, and this is completely at our discretion. for when we do that, that's when you will see something pop up. You'll get a notification. If you see one of these, you need to apply it right away, because it means it was very bad. And for our cloud customers, sometimes we'll actually apply WAF rules, the firewall rules, to protect customers during an escalation. Maybe we're just doing it as a precaution, and sometimes we'll do it if we're seeing unpatched customers on old versions that are maybe seeing some activity that's suspicious. We'll go back through and add rules to protect them, even though they haven't applied those latest patches. We aim to port all of the vulnerabilities to all the upcoming releases in such a way that when we do a release, it's always a set of releases. So most recently that would be 2.4.5 and 2.4.4 P1. Those all have the same fixes in them. So we have to structure our workflow in such a way where we're never releasing a patch for a vulnerability in one release and not another, because that would make any of those customers vulnerable. Now, I had to cut off some of the numbers here, but this is a rough view into the number of submissions we've had from our HackerOne program over time, over the last few years. And if you'll notice, it's a pretty sharp downward trend. So that's what we want to see. Most notably, those two down at the bottom, and 60% overall decrease from 2019 and 33% between 2020 and 2021. So these efforts are working, and this is one way to see that. If you do find a vulnerability, post it to HackerOne. You'll get paid, we get tickets created, everybody wins. You can also reach out to support, and they'll escalate it internally, or you can even reach out to me directly in community Slack. Don't do any of those other things, because that exposes everybody. Definitely don't post it on Twitter or on social media and any of that kind of stuff. Don't sell it on the black market. So our release strategy is not necessarily centered around security, but security relies on people upgrading. So really, my teams are involved in helping craft those release strategies. So looking at what we have now, it's this is a topic that we're often having to correct the perception of, because it is confusing and it can be hard to understand what's what. So first of all, the biggest question we get is, what's a supported release? Supported does not mean secure. It just means that you can pick up the phone and call support, and they won't hang up on you when you tell them what version you're running. So it doesn't mean that you have all the latest patches. It doesn't mean that you're ever going to get a direct patch that can be applied to you. But you would be eligible for a hotfix patch if we chose to issue one, and it affected that version. So you can see that, and the security patch releases that we issue, which are shown in the green boxes in this diagram, those are basically stopgaps. So the primary release path is the one represented by the red line that goes all the way across. We also, every time we have a full patch release, we release a security patch alongside it, so you can have one extra opportunity to stay secure without incurring the full cost of that upgrade for the next version. But to be clear, that is a stopgap solution purely to give you more time to plan for your upgrade for the full patch release version. And just to stress this point, the only patches that are currently PCI compliant and secure are the 3 that are currently highlighted, because those are the latest that are out, and we're beyond the guidelines for those. Just to illustrate this a little bit further with some scary numbers, if you're on these versions, you are very exposed. So I don't have the security specific patch versions along here, and if you were to you could technically pull all of these numbers from our security bulletins too, but just as some ammo to convince your stores to upgrade, here's some numbers for you. And just to further point out too that I'm showing which ones are PCI compliant and which ones are still supported. You really need to be on one of these blue ones right now, or you're going to have a bad time. This is a note about a new initiative that we are launching starting in November of this year, well, October and November. This is a paid offering for commerce customers only. It gives you the ability to have support beyond that window that I was just talking about. So this would keep support from hanging up on you when you tell them what version you're using. We will be issuing quarterly, in addition to picking up the phone, we will be issuing quarterly security only, core only patch releases starting in November all the way through the end of next year. The base versions that you have to be on are listed right there. It's those 5 versions. If you can get to one of those, you can get this product and move and be secure through the end of that to give you more time to plan. I will point out one huge benefit of doing this is that what we've never done before is the first patch that we are releasing will contain all vulnerability fixes that have been made since those versions. So the almost 200 fixes that I mentioned on the previous slide is included. If you're on 2.4.0 P1, you will be actually caught up for security, giving you a whole year to plan for your next big upgrade. Again, it's available to Commerce customers only, but there are discounts up to 100% available, and you can get more details from us later on that. Not upgrading is dangerous, as is probably clear. But it's hard to stay secure if you're not upgraded, and it's hard to upgrade for a variety of reasons. Only 12% of our customers have upgraded, our cloud customers have upgraded to 2.4.4 or 2.4.5. It's about 120 days since the 2.4 came out. And that's actually up from a 9% adoption rate from previous releases at that same 120-day mark. So that's good, but don't be that guy. Here's another bad one that I also had to cut the numbers off of. This is actually a distribution of our current cloud customers and what versions they're running. Notice the orange box dictating what versions they need to be on to stay secure and where all the other numbers are. That is not good. And you're not going to be alone if you aren't upgraded, just like all these guys, but you can all be hacked together too. We recognize that it's difficult to upgrade and that there's a lot of reasons for that. So let's talk about upgrading for a second. So first of all, the majority of upgrades from our research, the majority of upgrades that are made actually have the primary purpose of keeping the merchant secure. It's not for quality fixes or cool features or anything, performance, things like that. The number one reason is consistently security. And that's also backed up by the fact that we also have super fast adoption rates. So not only do people upgrade quickly, but then they stay on them longer. Security patch releases are typically a lot more stable and preferred because of what they are allowed to contain. They are only allowed to contain vulnerability fixes, any hot fixes that had been made, and that includes any hot fixes, not just security, that had been made since the previous version. In rare cases, we have some compliance items because we can't release an out-of-compliance version. And then in very rare cases, we'll have a feature-like fix that tries to address an entire class of vulnerabilities. So it's basically a vulnerability fix that manifests as a feature. They are not allowed to contain backwards incompatible changes, but security vulnerabilities are essentially undocumented features. So when we fix those, we can run into cases where we're accidentally removing intended behavior. But it can't include library fixes, non-hot fix changes, and just the last one's probably the most important one to point out here is there's no, but I really need this in the release. No, unless it's a hot fix, it doesn't go in. And talking about backwards incompatible changes, despite what it may seem, there's actually a very long list of things and a lot of people that has to go through in order to release a backwards incompatible change. So if it made it into the release, either it completely bypassed this product somehow, or it was really important and justified whatever the reason was to get it in there. But I will specifically point out on this slide that there's up to 5 levels of leadership that are involved in approving those, and that includes high-level stakeholders that will not accept an answer of, well, we want to, it's easy or whatever. We have to be really clear about why it's going in. I mentioned security changes are often inherently backwards incompatible. there's not a lot we can do about that, but we do weigh that very heavily when we're looking at changes. Sometimes the change is coming from a higher up Adobe security team that's saying it's going to be this way, it has to be implemented like this. If it's backwards incompatible, sorry. But that's not always the case. Usually there's room for us to say, okay, well, we'll disable this new feature. We'll disable this feature by default and add a configuration option to turn it back on. So it may be backwards incompatible when you install it, but if you absolutely have to have it, you can turn it back on. One of the other things that's complicated with backwards incompatibility is default values. So when we're releasing new features, we have to set values that work as a universal baseline for everybody, which is impossible because everybody has a different scale. Some customers will have a much larger scale and need bigger numbers, and that makes the smaller customers not secure, and the smaller customers need the smaller numbers in order for them to stay secure. It depends on the infrastructure and scale and all of that. And I'm going to throw out that we do have an upgrade compatibility tool, so if you are trying to plan for your upgrade, check that out because it really breaks down what you'll need to be able to make those upgrades. Now, I had to cut a lot out from this section. We are working on a new release strategy, but I cannot talk in detail about what it is. What I can say is that it's new and that there will be less patch releases with longer support windows, and it will be a much more consistent and simple process compared to what we have now. Our goal is to make it easier to stay secure for much longer, and it be easier and the releases are also aimed to be more stable so that you're not as worried to do those upgrades as they come out. In addition to vulnerability fixes, we also do a lot of defense in-depth work, which is layers of security beyond just the bare minimum to solve the problem. Many of the things on this list have probably caused some of you some troubles in the past, and they were all made with very good reason. I know that the 2FA change in particular was just wildly popular among the community, and so sorry about that, but that one was a must-have. But yeah, there's a lot of things on this list that are, and this is just a small list of examples. These are more like feature-like changes, but the defense in depth is not usually fancy new features like that. The boring framework level changes is listed on there too, because that's really where the heart of defense in depth is, where maybe it's like a low-level set of networking things, and I don't know, I'm not going to give a specific example, that would be bad, but we'll make the changes so that developers will be writing secure code using our secure foundation that we're providing. And just to kind of give that same slide for the preventative measures, it's not necessarily new features. We may have eliminated an entire class of vulnerability that you would otherwise be exposed to, even if it's not some flashy new feature. So this is what you're missing out on in this space if you haven't upgraded. I don't have the 2.3 numbers on here. It's a little bit difficult to kind of compare 2.3 and 2.4 because there's more in 2.4 than 2.3. So I want to call out the Magento scan tool. If you are not already enrolled in this, it is a free tool. You can add your site to it, and we do a bunch of checks, and we'll alert you if there's any obvious problems. We have a huge database of threat signatures. We've also partnered with Sansec, who, we're also getting their threat signatures. It's part of this tool as well. We also add, and speaking of static analysis tools, we also have we add many different tests and checks for our own code, and not just as developers are contributing, internal and external, but they enforce secure coding practices. So if we see that there's something wrong with that, it'll flag it. But then there's other layers of static checks too that go in and just scan the entire code base, looking for different ways that there may be issues. And occasionally we will also, if we're seeing if we found a potential issue with stuff moving forward, we'll also kind of back test that for our cloud customers, because we do have more access to that. We'll find that and alert them that they may have some kind of problem. Maybe they're storing data they didn't realize that they were storing, and help them stay secure. We also are part of we work on our secure life cycle. We integrate security into all parts of this because security is a mentality. It's not just a checklist. So we enforce our code reviews, which are a lot of which are security minded, where we have things that we look for, not just for like regular code review stuff, but obviously security. I mentioned the static code analysis already. That's run on everybody that's contributed knows that that's part of it, but you don't see that there's a whole set of other automated checks that are not publicly listed on your contributions that also run on all of those. And you only see the results of those if you did something really bad that you shouldn't have done. We have an internal, we separate our gatekeepers from our developers so that people are not pushing their own code. We want to, so that some people are writing it, then they give it to gatekeepers who review it and make sure all of the proper things were followed, and then they will merge it into mainline. We have a lot of effort put into our secure branching strategy. It's because of the nature of the external and internal contributors and it being open source, this is a particularly tricky problem. The way that we have basically two separate versions of Magento running at all times that are being contributed to. One of them has security changes and one of them doesn't. This especially gets complicated as we get into the regression testing cycle and the public betas and the release to all the people that need to get it. So we have a clear separation there so that we're not accidentally exposing upcoming security patches before they're supposed to be released. We have a development guild internally where development teams and products from all over commerce are represented, and we bring topics there to discuss. Maybe we have a security fix that we're looking to make or a new feature request. We can bring it up there and discuss it there and talk through what might be impacted and who might be impacted and how could we mitigate that, and it would be better to do it this way or whatever. So that's another way that we're, and the other way around too. Maybe it's not a security issue, but our team is also there and we can say, hey, that feature is probably not a good idea to build that way. Let's build it like this instead. That's more secure. We also work with our risk manager more heavily than some of the other security teams at Adobe, where if we have any decision that involves some kind of risk, maybe it's a trade-off between a security decision and that has negative impact, we can kind of weigh the different options and figure out where we should be making that decision. And then he'll kind of make the ultimate judgment call on that, or I should say the team will. Our team also works on product security reviews, so any products or features or whatever that are being developed, they will submit it up for our review, and we will go through and make threat models for it, which is all that last point there too. We'll go through and kind of model the product and how it works, identify any threats and how they're mitigated and what needs to be done. Sometimes there's critical items that come out of that, and other times we just acknowledge where we might be in more risky territory and where we want to balance that, and then we maintain those as we move forward. So that's pretty much it. No time for QA?